what we're going to do is Sister V and I are, first we're going to pray. First I'm going to do the instructions, then we're going to pray. And then Sister V and I are going to, we'll discuss the first chapter and then we'll have some conversation, and then we'll invite conversation in the chat, and really kind of work the questions that come through the chat. I'm going to invite you not to unmute yourselves, maybe until maybe near the end, but mostly we're going to try to facilitate this by doing questions in the chat. And the chat button is the one that's got the little, looks like the little cartoon captioning. And so we're going to go chapter by chapter. So we'll do the first chapter, have some conversation, and then invite some chat conversation, second chapter, and then conversation, and third chapter. And we'll be done by about 9 o'clock. The other thing that I decided that I thought would be fun is I thought it would be fun to have a book raffle at each of these gatherings, because why wouldn't you? And so we're going to raffle off the new Frederick Douglass biography. I can see Joanna suddenly perked up. And Anna has figured out how we might do that. And we'll do that at the end, because if you don't stick through it all the way, well, you don't get to maybe get the book raffle. But anyway, that's how I envision us doing this. Sister V, did you want to chime in with anything I have forgotten?
I think you covered it all.
You're like, no, I don't want to chime in. So, all right, well then, tell you what, how about tonight, I'll start us with prayer, and Sister V, if you'll end us with prayer. And,
okay.
And Anna, you're all good to explain the raffle near the end?
Yep. No one needs to do anything. I can just get everyone's name and we can do it from there.
Oh, see, that's so fun. I love technology. So, all right, friends, thank you very, very much for being with me and with each other for this conversation. So, the Lord be with you. Thank you. Let us pray. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Continue to be with us. Continue to enable us to use our eyes, our two eyes to see, our two ears to hear, and only our one mouth to speak. May we learn in that proportion, seeing and hearing and taking it all in, and then reflecting back, gracious God. And may we use the gifts you've given us, the oh so many gifts you've given us, to do something, to bit by bit transform our lives and our world, so that we might be the beloved community that you long for us to be. May we take that risk and be vulnerable. May we be steadfast. May we have courage and compassion. And may we be fierce as we are gentle, but never fragile. In your holy name we pray. Amen. All right. There is, in fact, a book study to this book. It's a free book study, and at some point you can look for it. But it's a piece that Sister V and I are going to be working off of. And let me see. I am looking to see if I can find mine. All right. Okay. So, and I'm not finding it. So, Sister V, I'm just going to count on you with all of that. Um, so, but let's get started. And we figured out our first question we wanted to work with. Did you want to offer that, Sister V?
Yeah, it was about what makes you uncomfortable. What did you read in that first chapter that made you kind of just, or even the introduction that made you uncomfortable as you were going through it?
Yeah. And there's this great line in there, and this is from Michael Eric Dyson's his I think it's from his intro, and actually no, it's yeah, it is. It's from his intro, and he says, "I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color." I was like, whoa. And on some level that that I felt a kinship to that, because I know when I was doing a lot of work for LGBTQ inclusion stuff, it was really clear to me that it was the liberals that were the hard ones. I knew where the conservatives stood, but the liberals, as best as I could tell, listened to the last person who made them feel bad. and so it was hard, and so I read this and I thought, oh, he's talking about me. And then he goes on and says that that there is D'Angelo Robin goes on and says that significant parts of our white script are hinged on our notion that we are objective and unique. And that's on like page 9-ish, right in through there. And it seems to me this notion of taking I'm a unique individual made in God's image and likeness. Yes, all true. And this notion that because I am unique, and that I must not be part of the problem. And yet, as I kind of delve into this more and more, I realize this might be where the fragility part comes in. I realize that I can read a certain amount, and then I need to stop, because there's this a little bit of a there's a chunk of shame in there.
It's interesting because Michael Eric Dyson talking about, progressives being the biggest problem, it brought me back to, something I enjoyed with St. John's Royal Oak, shout out to you guys, earlier this year, Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and talking about how, actually it's the moderates who are really holding things back because they don't want to be uncomfortable. And, and that was an obstacle. But the uniqueness and this idea of individuality, when as a person of color, that's something that I rarely encounter. People of color very often get grouped into that big lump. Yeah. And so we're not seen as an individual right away. So when I was reading this, I'm like, wow, okay, yeah, white people probably wouldn't be used to always being seen as this kind of monolith, this monolithic other, where people of color are used to that.
Rarely am I asked to speak for my entire class of people. Although sometimes people want to say, what do lesbians think? I'm like, are you kidding? Um, but but it is, and there's this also this sense of because because I'm an individual and I stand apart from other people, I am the exception, and it's that American exceptionalism. I'm an exception from the rule, and there I find myself wanting to wave my hand and say to my friends of color, I'm a good guy, right? I'm a good guy. Um, and that's on my own personal piece. But there's also this notion that this idea that we're both objective and unique. And so the objectivity is that sense that my perspective is not completely filtered by all of my experiences, except really only to enhance them, right? Because I'm interesting, but to enhance my experiences, but that I've got the take on this that is free from some bias.
Yeah, I love how she just so clearly puts how we're all in this socialization, whether we like it or not. We are all swimming in this same water, and it shapes how we see and how we think about ourselves and about others. We're not unbiased. None of us are, because we have this entire, history of socialization in this country that means that we're not without bias. It's there, whether we recognize it or not.
And when she starts constructing, and I don't know if this is like getting to like our second question, was that about social
Go for it anyway.
Okay. So this idea that there are all these constructs and ideologies that we live with, and an ideology that and that we're socialized to, and I know, and sometimes I buy it, and sometimes I don't. But when she's sort of putting it out there, she's saying that according to the ideology of individualism, that race is irrelevant. And we hear that when I'll say, well, I don't see race, right? But we know that that the ideologies are still at play, because we know that in our world, do you have more power if you're male or if you're female? Do you earn more money if you're male or if you're female? Do you earn more money if you are black or white? Are you accorded more privileges if you are able-bodied or are differently abled? Do parents want their kids to be cis gender, right? Or do they want their kids to be transgender? And how many of us didn't even know the word cis until I didn't even know it was a thing until 5 years ago. But it's this whole idea is that rich in our world, oh, that's better because you don't want to be poor. We don't want anybody to be poor, but we don't want to be poor. And gay or straight. And so there's all of these identities. And the one that I haven't said, because white people, I sometimes would prefer not to talk about it. I haven't said about, oh, there's a difference, it's better to be white than to be black or a person of color in our world. And I desperately want to live in a country that says it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that idea of the individualism, that ideology, that gives us the excuse that, well, if you didn't make it, it was all your fault. You didn't work hard enough, you didn't merit it. That idea, that ideology of individualism means that it's all on you. There's no structure around you that's affecting you at all. Yeah. And I love how she said that, actually we gain this idea of who we are through, the shared and unavoidable, messages we get around us from television, movies, song lyrics, magazines, textbooks, schools, religion, literature. I mean, she just goes on through this list that's surrounding us and shaping us that we may not actually notice right away.
Right. Right. And if I live where, which at least a chunk of my world, I lived as a racial minority when I lived in Hawaii, and then I moved to Virginia, and I was no longer a racial minority. But it was a really rude awakening when I went from Long Island to Hawaii, and went in Long Island. I knew no one of color. And then I got to Hawaii, and I was one of two kids in a class with blue eyes, and two white kids, two haoles in the classroom, and the teachers were Asian, and it was a whole different world. And then I went back to Virginia, and thought, oh, thank God it's normal again.
Yeah, she mentions, that we're socialized to think of white as the norm, as the default, and even as the ideal. And so that very much shapes how we see people around us. And for a person of color, it shapes how we see ourselves.
But I never, literally 3 years ago, this woman who's great and who is like really Stacy Flint, shout out to Stacy Flint, pushed me and pushed me and pushed me at All Saints as I began to sort of realize I hadn't done enough. I hadn't done anything. But she said, well, Bonnie, what we've got to deal with is our whiteness. And I was like, what do you mean our whiteness? What does that mean? And I was clueless. And she said, no, it's about the whiteness. People have to grapple with their whiteness and what that means. And I literally looked at her and I said, well, that's a short group. I mean, what does that mean? What am I supposed to do with that? I said, they can't run a group on that. Because it's the norm.
Right. You're not meant to see it as, you're not meant to see it at all. It's what the norm is. It's the default. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's the one other piece that I know I want to go back to, because I feel like we might want to be thinking about moving to our discussion. But there's this great definition about white fragility. And I thought, let's just get that out there right now. And she says, white fragility, anger, fear, guilt, argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress. And it's from the stress of talking about race. And that we work to reinstate white equilibrium, to repel the uncomfortable challenge, return to our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. And she says this, white fragility is not a weakness, but a powerful means of white racial control and the way to protect white advantage. I'm too stressed out to talk about this. It's hard. I'm scared. I'm gonna say the wrong thing. So if you and I can just kind of hang out instead, that would be better for me. Could you make my life easier?
It shuts down the hard conversations that we have to have. White fragility does. And, I love the other phrase, racial stamina. And there's a couple other writers, I've heard it from Eula Biss and Claudia Rankine, talk about white people needing to build up the stamina to have to deal with this issue. Where people of color, we don't have much choice. We have to deal with every minute of every day. Mm-hmm. Where white people have had the choice of saying, you know what, I just don't want to deal with it right now. I'm gonna think about something else. Yeah. And when you're a person of color, you can't do that. And so she talks about white people building up that stamina to be able to keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Yeah. And the ability to dip in, like I'll dip into the work. And then I'm like, okay, now I have to go back to this. Yeah. Now, okay, I've done a lot on, I'm working racial justice, right? But I have to be the bishop for everyone. Code, the white people are going to get mad because I've been talking about race a lot. And so I have to do something else. And I'm not saying it's all that I do race all the time, but what I realize is that as a white person, I can dip in and I can dip out.
Yeah, and as a person of color, there's absolutely no moment in your life that's not shaped by race.
And race, I think this was the other piece, is the race. Oh, that's chapter 2, so we can stop there.
Yeah, good segue.
Okay, friends, thoughts in the chat, and you can even reference page numbers if you've got one of the books. But what was a part of, and throw it in here, what was a part of the passage that you read that made you uncomfortable? Start typing them in. Oh, here we go. Okay, our opinions are uninformed. I can be seen as qualified to lead an organization with no understanding whatsoever of people of color or ability to engage critically about race. And this has been true for me at the university and in the church. The notion of culturally competent had to be added to the canons. What else, friends? What other passages in this chapter in the intro stood out for you? And if you're in the chat, you can also see that Anna put in the book study link.
Whoops.
Go for it.
Sorry, it took me a second to open it up. To interrupt white fragility, we need to build our capacities to sustain the discomfort of not knowing, the discomfort of being racially unmoored, and the discomfort of racial humility.
Yeah. One of the things I've learned again and differently living in the city of Detroit is that I don't own English. In Detroit, it's a buggy, not a cart. People say stay instead of live somewhere. One thing I hear and we've heard here is the hope to not see the difference. I think this is also the language that standardizes white as norm. We all want to be seen in our specificities and loved and welcomed because of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Richard Wright was highlighted when he said, "There is no Negro problem, there is a white problem." It made me think that I have to constantly be thinking about what being white means. I like to think hard about my intersectionalism because it helps me think about being white.
Mm-hmm. Friends, what does being white mean to you? Those of you who happen to be white on this call, have you ever thought about it? Throw it into the chat. Okay, it's the norm, having society set up so that I'm the norm and the default. Yeah.
A friend once described privilege generally as a helpful set of blinders.
Yeah, I never thought about it. I just always was.
An interesting comment that it means American.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, yeah. Never having to think about race. Yeah, it's not something I think too much about. Yeah.
The automatic benefit of the doubt in most situations in most places in the world.
Whew. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I wonder what it is that people realize about their whiteness. I definitely didn't realize it until I was in a public school in Hawaii. Never occurred to me before that. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. What were the other pieces that we were looking at in that? So think about, friends, your sense of individuality and objectivity. When was there a sense that you were kind of frustrated, that you thought that you had an idea about maybe being shaped and formed by those ideologies? Yeah. Oh, there you go. So, introduced to racism through adults as I grew up. I think she's got a point. She's got well, we can talk about that a little bit more in the next chapter. Um, I think she's going to say that the racism from adults and from so much more, which maybe that might be, maybe that's our pivot to the second chapter there. Um, all right. And this one, man, racism and white supremacy. All right, Sister V, where do you want to go?
Well, I mean, it's interesting how she talked about, you know, using just those words can shut people down. And she talks about, you know, in politics, you know, having, if you talk about it differently, if you say, well, we're trying to control immigration or we're anti-globalists, you can actually hold on to the ideology without saying the words white supremacy or racism, even though that's the ideology it's upholding. Yeah. So I think, you know, and you can talk about what it means, what it feels like as a white person to have these kind of words applied to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna do a little poll here, friends. Her definition of what a racist act is, right? Essentially, she says that that a racist act is usually something that is done by an individual who is malicious. I've kind of like paraphrased that. But it's a bad person doing something immoral, something wrong. How many of you thought of racism as that definition early on? I mean, I did, right? So, yeah, I'm seeing a few, yeah, seeing. So when someone said to me, "You're a racist," I was not happy with them. For the record, I was like, "What do you mean I'm a racist?" And because I'm not a bad person, although to be fair, I have bad days and I've done some crappy things in my life and I've not been nice at various points, right? But I'm like, but I'm not overall and I'm not, and I don't set out to do racist things. So how can you call me, or how can you name me as being racist? And what I realized is if that's your definition, if your definition of racism is that it's an individual act that's immoral done by a person who is not acting as they should, well, then no wonder most people push back.
And I think it's actually in the first chapter where she has these questions. She says, okay, breathe. This is not what I'm saying about you. But, she is saying that it's, that we all have these prejudices, but that racism is that prejudice put into action. Yeah. And it's put into action with people who have power and the resources to preserve a set of privileges that are based on those prejudices. And it doesn't have to be an individual act. It can be a system. Yeah. And so, when she says you're part of this racist system, she's not saying you're the problem. She's saying you are embedded in this whole system that is the problem.
Yeah. And then she goes on to say that she says, I think she uses the example, can a Black person may not wait on me in a store, this is on page 22, but they cannot, so they may ignore me in the store, I'm not doing this, right? But that person cannot pass laws that prohibit me and everyone like me from buying houses in a certain neighborhood. Like, boom, there's the structural nature of it. That if you think about, and friends, you're just gonna think I'm so ignorant, but I'm just gonna go out there for you. My idea of the notion of what redlining was, I thought it just meant that banks didn't loan money to a certain part of the city because it was dangerous there, read Black, poor, right? And so they didn't invest there because it wasn't a good investment. And I'm like, well, not nice, but what I didn't know until about 3 years ago is that it was written into the law and that you couldn't get a federally backed loan for areas that were redlined. And I was like, oh my God, it was in the law that you couldn't do this. And that then set up predatory lending practices where people bought on contract and you had no equity. And that if you fell behind, and missed a mortgage payment for a week, that your house was just taken from you. And I was like, oh, now I understand why the north side of Chicago, I apologize, I'm not so good with, I can't name the Detroit neighborhoods yet, but now I understand why the north side of the city of Chicago was so affluent and why Lawndale on the southwest side was such, it wasn't where you wanted to live. And I was like, oh my God, it was in law.
Yeah. And if you ever want to learn more about that, there's a great series done by the program on the media, the NPR program, and it's called The Scarlet E. And it just completely delves into that, what housing discrimination did generation upon generation. But, and for her to highlight, Robin DiAngelo to highlight what it means, for people of color, and then for white people to have this different narrative of why we're segregated. Yeah. So you just knew that, that part of Chicago is just not where you want to live. It's poor, it's run down. and you weren't given the truth about why that happened.
Right?
Yes.
And here's another piece that that's in the chat that didn't know until recently, same here, that the GI Bill was not available for Black World War II vets. GI Bill, single most important piece to elevate people, enable people to gather some wealth. Sending these guys to college, not available. So it's, yeah. Right, there you go. Redlining is like putting quicksand down and then asking you why you can't lift yourself up.
Yeah.
If you only worked harder. And not, and I didn't know it. Now that's, to be fair, I can tell you facts about biology you might not know, but I didn't know it.
Yeah. But she points out that, she calls it the white racial frame. You're given this framework for the reality you see that is meant to preserve, your sense of whiteness, your sense of being, of deserving what you have, of deserving better than those people.
Right. Yeah, because and here's something I would hear at home, because my father is one of 13, and they were super poor, and he was the first in his family to go to college, and he got a commission and became an officer in the Marine Corps. He worked hard. No taking any of that away from him. And it was really clear that much of what he was able to pull off, if he had been Black skinned, those opportunities would not have been there for him.
Yeah, and Robin DiAngelo really makes it clear. She says, I'm not discounting, the experience of immigrants coming to this country with nothing, fleeing persecution if you're Jewish in Europe. It's not that other people and other groups don't have hardship, but there is this very specific and very institutional and systemic hardship based on race in this country. And it's not taking away from anyone's hard work, but it is saying that you have access to resources and opportunities that are systemically denied on the basis of race.
Which, let's go back to that for a minute. Race is a construct. And this is one I didn't know until I typed my partner Susan's dissertation, which was all about racism and the James Foreman delivering the Black Manifesto at a church service at Riverside Church in New York City. And so I cut her 75-page first chapter down to 22 and made her put in more periods per page, but that's another story. But this notion that people, literally, it's made up. It's adaptations because of geographic locations. And what I love is Ta-Nehisi Coates is, he's got this quote in here says that race is the child of racism, not the father. And it goes on to, first we exploited people for their resources, not according to how they looked.
Yeah, and she references another good book that I know it's on our resource page on the Diocesan website, Stamped for the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. And he talks about how, once you decided that, you have these high ideals written in the Bill of Rights and in the in the Constitution about everyone being equal and under the eyes of God. Well, if you're going to do that and still continue slavery, there's a little bit of dissonance there. So how do we explain away And they explain it away by saying, well, these are inferior. These are not quite human. And we explained that dissonance away by race. And so that it was constructed to maintain basically a way of economic life.
Is this the chapter where the bird cage comes in?
I'm not sure, but we can talk about it anyway.
Now, oh, and what you guys should know is I couldn't find a copy of this book. So Sister V delivered a copy, her copy of the book to my door. And what you should know is it's completely annotated. But as I read it, I realized I was underlining different things than she was. Like consistency. Oh, and by the way, I didn't actually underline things in her book. I don't want you to think I'm rude, but everything I wrote, I thought she had some very good points that she underlined, but I realized, oh my God, we are looking at this, from two different perspectives.
And I think that's what struck me when I first read this, when it came out back in 2018. It was, you know, for me, it was seeing someone basically articulate the reality that I always knew and had to live in, but that if you're a white person, you didn't have to see. And so when I read this book, I was, you know, I'm looking at, oh, wow, she noticed that. Oh, she knows what's going on. Okay, this is great. Where, you know, if you're not having that experience or close to someone who's having that experience, yeah, you're going to see completely different things in this book than a person of color would.
Right. And so go with the notion of the bird cage, right? And which I thought this worked super well. And somebody, yay, Sarah Hackett got it. It's on page 23, friends. But this notion that if you're looking at a bird very close to the bird cage, right? You only see the bird. And then you wonder, if you're just, right? You wonder, well, why is the bird not flying away, right? Or if you step back a tiny bit more, then you see maybe one of the wires to the cage. And you think, well, that's an obstacle, but surely a decent bird, a hardworking bird, would get around that obstacle. And then when you step back a bit farther, you begin to see the interlocking wires that literally enable the bird to move this far, but no farther. And I think that's the piece for myself as I've begun to try to learn more and more about race and white privilege, where I've begun to see more of the wires. And then I have to say, friends, there are times when I then want to turn away because it's all a bit much. And I do that privilege of a white person because I can turn away. But maybe as a person of faith, well, maybe that's why we're knee deep. All of us are knee deep in this. What else were we hoping for in this chapter?
I've been sort of, you know, keeping an eye on chat, and people have had some really interesting comments about those. But we were also
yeah. So I'm just looking at the Detroit Expressway comment.
Yeah. I think we were talking about, you know, the racial socialization. You know, how do we become aware of it? And, you know, where do you see it in your own experience?
I know I know that um, when um, in Chicago, I lived on the north side of the city, which is largely white, also Hispanic. Um, and the folks who attended All Saints were mostly white. Um, and I know that at when people who happen to be of color, Black folks, um, would show up at different times than on a Sunday morning, I would be like, so I wonder what they want. Um, and it would be different if someone would show up on when the church started looking nice, um, they'd show up and they'd be standing outside the church, and it would be, I would think, oh, they're interested in the architecture. African American person showed up, and I'd be like, oh, the pantry's not open.
Yeah.
And that socialization, but that it's totally on me. um, and I had made a deal with myself, because I live next door to the church. So I had made a deal with myself after the first 2 years that I would never approach anyone unless I was going to be gracious to them, because I was the priest. Because I had had a couple of days off where I was cranky to people, and I realized that was really not good for the church. So I was always gracious, but in the back of my head, those are my questions. And I realized that it was always hard, that there's a socialization um, of, oh, I'm supposed to do something here. You must need something. Like who the heck am I?
Yeah, she has this great quote. She says, this is Robin DiAngelo. How did I get the message that we were better people? Consider how we talk about white neighborhoods: good, safe, sheltered, clean, desirable. By definition, other spaces, not white, are bad, dangerous, crime-ridden, and to be avoided. And of course, we think the same about people. When we have this socialization that, if you're a person of color and you're walking up to a church in off hours, then yeah, you're probably poor, you need food, you're looking for, some kind of assistance. Not that you're interested in the architecture. But I mean, that is part of the whole socialization message that all of us receive.
And she makes the point that those of us who lived in communities that were even more segregated were in fact more captive to those ideologies. So rather than this notion of I live in a white community and go to a white church, and so I don't know about racism, she makes the point that actually, if you've been largely confined to only interacting with people who happen to be white, and you happen to be white, then that person's perception of someone who is of color is going to be so much more shaped by media images, and portrayals, as opposed to my friend blah blah, my friend so and so, my cousin so and so, and I just thought that was really interesting, because so often we will say, and what I mean by that, I mean white people will say, and I also realize how often I say we, and I just mean, it's like, oh, the normal people, right? The white people, that will say, oh, but I don't know anything about that. I'm not racist. I don't have any of those experiences because there are no people of color around me. Chapter 3, friends. Other thoughts on, before we move on to that, but anything else on that struck you guys with racism and discrimination and oh, you know what we left out? They would like that. We left out the whole piece about white supremacy. Same poll, friends. How many people always thought of the notion of white supremacy meant that you had to be walking around in sheets and be part of the Ku Klux Klan, right? There you go. Right? The woman, Stacey Flint, who was really pushing me, she goes, we have to talk about white supremacy. I was like, what are you talking about, white supremacy? We don't have those people. And I have to say, part of my critique is going to be, I really wish all these words didn't mean two different things. But go to the point where you were talking about how that has that on some level the white supremacists have made that happen.
Yeah, she has that really. I think, I'm not sure if that's in chapter 2 or not, but how, you know, people who wanted to continue this ideology realized, you know, we have to get away from the words that people don't want to be associated with. So they still want to be associated with the actions that we're taking, you know, against immigration, keeping your neighborhood quote unquote safe from those people. But so we need to find, you know, some other ways of saying, you know, let's control immigration. Let's be tough on crime. You know, let's do these things that will keep us separate from those people without actually saying we're white supremacists and we're racist. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go to racism being highly adaptive. And this is the 3rd chapter there. And if we pretend not to notice race, then there can be no racism. And I think there's this notion that that if we say that we don't see color, that's probably not true, and unless you are actually someone who's unable to see. And there's this notion of then kind of denying a person's reality of their life, because so much of their life is defined by race. And if it's defined by race and whiteness isn't, then whiteness never gets studied. And if it doesn't get studied, whiteness doesn't get critiqued. And there's a question in the chat. So how can we get out of this white system that privileges us? How can we fix the problem? What action should we take? How can we tear down these racial divides? And I think the first thing is to start noticing them. I think the first thing is to notice that being white enables us to do things that our sisters and brothers who happen not to be white are not able to freely do. And there's someone's replying back that skipping too quickly to solutions, it does enables us to not grasp the depth of the problem. So I don't think this is intractable, friends. But I have to say, 3 weeks isn't going to fix it. But go ahead.
And there's going to be discomfort. You know, and we're all, as we like to leap to solutions, but we also like to leap to things that'll make us feel better in the short term. And that's a very American thing. Just make me feel better right now. And that's not going to happen with this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because, and this is part of what she's talking about, that racial bias is largely unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's the part where we get to, and by that I mean white people, we get to breathe a little bit and say that we get formed by this. Our call as people of faith is to begin seeing how we have been shaped and formed by this. And that, and when we get defensive about it, that prevents us from looking at the issues. So as D'Angelo says, we should be saying, oh, thank you. Oh, no, now I get to actually kind of address that. I had no idea it was there. It's kind of like, friends, you know, when sometimes you happen to walk out of the restroom and you're trailing toilet paper on your foot, right? We've seen that. You want someone to tell you. It's not your fault, right? But we have to, but you have to, so it's like, oh, so that's my white privilege thing I'm trailing.
And I've seen a couple of comments about, you know, well, what about feeling so bad about this? What about the guilt? What about the shame? And I go back to a good Benedictine nun who said there's this thing called holy discontent. You know, that when you do feel bad about this situation, that's probably the Holy Spirit saying, yeah, this is bad. There's something you need to do about it. And so, you know, part of D'Angelo's concept of white fragility is that, you know, there is this structure where white people can avoid feeling bad. And that's why it's perpetuated. When in fact, you know, you need to sit with the discomfort for a little while, because that's where change is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And she talks about that we have a cultural norm that insists we hide our racism from people of color and deny it among ourselves, but not that we actually challenge it. When we start challenging it is when we get penalized for it. So, I mean, I wonder, and she has this piece, I thought these were really interesting. She was talking about the adversive racism. She did types of racism. And I'm like, oh my God, who knew there were flavors? But so and that's the rationalizing of the racial segregation. And it's having unconscious bias that surface in coded conversations. But there's this thing that, and she talks about backstage and center stage, and the conversations that might get held between white people, but those same conversations wouldn't be said in front of a Black person, because we didn't want them to feel bad, or we know we shouldn't say it, or we don't want to offer that perception. But I was just really struck by the not, that for some reason, well, for a bunch of reasons, but, and I think a lot of folks, I'm always afraid of getting it wrong, right? Friends, I talk about like fragility. I can't even tell you. Like, I'm going to walk into my backyard and scream after we get off the Zoom call. But it's that thing of being afraid of getting it wrong, and as a result, never talking about it, but then having conversations with white people that perpetuate it, sometimes not even meaning to. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
yeah. And later on, as we go on through this book, she'll talk about this concept of white solidarity, that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, white people just do not want to be seen as bad people. So you're going to be careful what you say, right? Because, you know, I don't want to be seen as a bad person if I say the wrong thing. And trying to preserve that sense of, but I'm still a good person, means often completely avoiding the conversation. And that means that nothing gets resolved. But it also means that, you know, white people get to stay in this comfortable place of, you know, of how society is ordered right now.
With the notion, she says white fragility, and this is how she ends the 3rd chapter. One thing of white fragility is the refusal to know.
Yeah.
So, friends, and you've been gracious and you've listened to Sister V and I honestly, and I'm happy to, you know, receive feedback afterwards about how we could do this better. I just know that with 79 people on this call, to have random conversation, it would just kind of be all over the place. So I apologize that we've been limiting to the chat.
I really enjoy the comments that have been in chat. I've been keeping track of those. They were just great comments in there.
Yeah. So what I know is that all of you have gathered to engage in this odd conversation. But what I love is that there are 79 people and there are a couple of people on, you know, so there's more than 80 people hanging out doing this. I just want to invite you to continue to come back again next week, to invite some other folks, and send me your thoughts. I take feedback, and let's keep working on this. I'm going to keep working on this, and I would love for you to continue to journey with me. And I am so thankful to Sister V to enable me to have a talk show again. So let's, Anna, can you tell us who won the Frederick Douglass biography?
Yeah, let me share my screen and we can do the pulling of the name right now.
Okay. Because this is obscure. All right. Oh, and friend, and then what I'm going to need you to do, and Anna will copy it, please, Anna, is when you win, please put your address into the chat and we'll copy it. And then we'll take it out of the chat. Susan.
Susan Chaklos.
All right. Where's Susan? Unmute yourself and cheer.
Are you here, Susan?
I don't know. Do you have to be here to win?
I mean, you said that in the beginning, so.
But wait, let's see. Let's see. Susan, are you here? Oh, sigh. All right. Well,
all right.
Draw another one and
oh, no, there she is.
There she is. Yay! Unmuted. Okay. Okay, let's see. Have to unmute her. Where? Okay, I can't do it, but you can work the chat, Susan. Good job. All right. No, sorry. So pick.
She's unmuted now.
There she is. Congratulations.
Whoa.
Susan, do me a favor. Stick your email address. Actually, why don't you?
Or if you're not comfortable with that, I just put my
Yeah.
email in the chat. You can email me.
Send it to Anna, and then we'll get that.
Okay.
We'll get the book sent to you. All right. So, Sister V, if you would pray us out, please.
Okay, I'm going to borrow a prayer from Michael Lunig. Let us pray. In order to be truthful, we must do more than speak the truth. We must also hear the truth. We must also receive the truth. We must also act upon the truth. And we must also always search for truth, the difficult truth, within us and around us. We must devote ourselves to truth, otherwise we are dishonest and our lives are mistaken. God grant us the strength and the courage to be truthful. Amen.
Amen. Wow. Thank you all. I didn't realize I had gotten, my light had gotten so dark here. And cue the dog. Thank you all very, very, very much for coming. And please come. Oh, look, there's one, Tally.
And yes, the next session will be covering chapters 4 through 6. We're doing 3 chapters at a time. So yep, next week we'll go through chapters 4 through 6. And I think Anna put the link to the study guide on the website. So you can even get that for free. It's a PDF.
So there we go, friends. Thank you very much. Have a blessed evening. All right. Good night.
Night.